All right, we are back on to Venezuela here, and I have Cira Pascual, Marquina. Cira was here last report I did on Venezuela, and we've brought another protagonist to join us. Chris Gilbert is they've authored a lot of stuff together. So if you guys look them up, Cira Pascual and Chris Gilbert, they're co-hosts of Escuela de Cuadros, and they have books together. Their most recent book is Commune or Nothing. But they have other books coming out, and they're in Venezuela. They're longtime activists in the Bolivarian process. And so we're going to talk about what's been going on in Venezuela. So first of all, you guys, I guess I'm with the countdown because the Nobel Prize Committee has the chair gave Maria Corina Machado the actual prize. I don't actually know what the Nobel Prize looks like. Is it like like an Oscar, like a little golden man or something? But maybe a stick of dynamite because Nobel was dynamite. So and he said Maduro should step down. So I guess any minute now, Maduro's probably going to step down because we didn't know that the Nobel Prize Committee wanted him to step down. So first of all, I'd like your reactions on that. Do you think it'll be today? Do you think it'll be tomorrow? Uh, what do you think?
Well, it's, of course, it is rather funny that these people think that they can determine how the world would work. It is They are actually spokespeople of U.S. imperialism, obviously, and U.S. imperialism has been added for really 26 years, trying to overthrow the Bolivarian government. So um, it's just an expression of what they are about to. Uh, what they think they can do, what they think their right is, what they are entitled to.
Mhm.
And of course, we are sure that President Maduro is not going to step down. There's not going to be any such thing happening. And the people of Venezuela are really ready to defend the revolution, to defend the process, to defend ultimately sovereignty. You
Yeah.
don't have to be uh, part of the Bolivarian process. You don't have to be a Chavista to be with sovereignty. But most people are with the Bolivarian process, and 90 something percent of Venezuelans are, of course, against this whole regime change operation that has been going on for decades.
When I saw the images, I wished I was Eduardo Galeano or had the capacity to describe kind of like the contrast that it represents with the reality of Venezuela, like all these pallid oligarchs. I say with their icy hands because I think of Maria Corina Machado as kind of like death. People here locally call her La Sayona, which is like
What's
a spirit that brings death to people. So
yeah,
I thought
yeah.
of all these pallid people in the cold northern country and how they're kind of like, I would say they promote an exterminist agenda. I mean,
Yeah.
Maria Corina, when she received the prize, she said she was happy that they seized the tanker, and she's repeatedly called for invasions of the country. So indeed, they're merchants of death up there, pallid merchants of death. And by contrast, like what we were living through in the past 3 days here, has been the People's Assembly for Peace and Sovereignty, which was a warm, not cold, warm, not cold, but warm celebration, multicolor celebration that involved fishing folk
Mhm.
coming together. People came from all around Latin America. People came from very far away in spite of the challenges. And so there was this warm life celebration, life-focused celebration here in the global South that contrasted so sharply with their frigid fingers of death in the North.
Yeah, I actually think that's great. I had a kind of a rough agenda and an order that I wanted to talk about, but you touched on so many other things, and I want to talk about the assembly, the Asamblea Popular por la Paz y la Soberanía en Nuestra América, the Assembly for Peace, the People's Assembly for Peace and Sovereignty in our America, Nuestra América. And I was looking at the program, and I did sort of like full of envy watch the video. There's like an 8 hour video. I'll put a link in the show description, but there's an 8 hour video where they had a camera on one of the stages. So I got to see some of the talks and listen to some of the talks. But the topics were, it was like, you know, it was a conference. There were delegates from all over the Americas. I imagine from elsewhere too. And I watched, you know, some government people, some Cuban. I listened to a speech by several Cuban delegates, an Argentinian woman, and I was like, is she? I was trying to figure out if she was with the government, and I was like, there's no way this woman is with the government. So she had like a big keffiyeh on, like you. I was like, okay, she's not with Javier Milei. And so the topics were like Bolivarian peace, Bolivarianism versus Monroeism, the economic war and political extortion, voices of the New World against the cognitive war, defense of the rights of migrants versus supremacy, xenophobia, defense of, I listened to several talks about the defense of Mother Earth against the climate emergency, and then a union of the peoples of the Global South. Generation Z specific panel, I didn't see. Militarization and neo-colonization. And then today it looks like there was an encounter with fisher folk. So, you know, I have a few things that I kind of pulled out of that. But I'd like to just give you guys the floor. What were the points, you guys who were actually there, what were the points for you?
So, as Chris was saying earlier, it really was an important space of gathering from people from around the world, but not as many as we hoped for. Both Chris and I were there, and Justin, with hundreds of others, were supposed to be here in the assembly. But as probably everyone knows who's watching the program, the U.S. has tried to impose a no-fly zone over Venezuela that has actually had effects over many airlines that have ceased to fly into Venezuela. So there were hundreds of people who came, but about 2/3 of the people who were supposed to come could not make it for different reasons. Actually, some people who made it took 2 and 3 days to make it to Venezuela. Imagine that. So, excuse me for that. But that actually gives you a little bit of the context, of the war context that we are living. And that makes it all the more relevant that we were gathering here in Caracas for 3 days to basically try to build, and actually I think succeed at building alliances, at tejiendo, as we say, as bringing together people from around the world to think about really this period of U.S. imperialism that has a very overt face here in Venezuela, but of course the impacts of U.S. imperialism in the situation of crisis of its hegemony, it touches everyone around the world. And indeed today there was a gathering in La Guaira, with fisher folk. Fisher folk also participated through the Congress, through the Assembly. They are very combative. They are people who really kind of like convey their disposition to fight and struggle. And today the meeting with them was actually by the ocean, by the sea, an ocean that is being attacked by U.S. imperialism, that has been attacked by U.S. imperialism since early September.
Sure. One thing that really impressed me was the treatment of Bolivarianismo and Monroeism. Sometimes I'm not so satisfied with the way people present both the Monroe Doctrine and the response to it. But I think the most important thing is that, first of all, we did present the response, that I think sometimes people look at Trump's explicitly revives the Monroe Doctrine. I think it comes out in this recent strategy document. But as far as I can figure out, there's what he calls a Trump corollary is just saying that the Monroe Doctrine still exists. Trump seems especially eager to have to have his name attached to something. So he put the name Trump corollary over, I guess, simply the revival of the Monroe Doctrine. But I think one of the problems with the way that's often treated is that, first of all, people think that just by decreeing something it can happen.
Yeah.
And in fact, to make it happen, it requires real force. Certainly there's real force in the Caribbean. But there's also a real counterforce, and that's the unity of Latin American peoples. That's our willingness to fight. And there is the Bolivarian doctrine. So I was impressed by the way Delcy Rodriguez talked about Bolivarianism with a lot of science. And she pointed out how Bolivar had a real project, a real project to counterpose the Monroe doctrine, which was to unify Latin American peoples, and to also a social project that involved liberation, emancipation, whereas Monroe himself was an enslaver. Bolivar worked to, not successfully, but worked to emancipate enslaved people, and generally promoted a more egalitarian society. He used the phrase, the maximum sum of happiness, in a particular discourse, leaning, I guess, on utilitarian thought, but an effort to express that a goal of a government should be to provide happiness. And he also said social security to people. So there was a good exposition of these counter doctrines, but also even more important was the willingness to fight and the capacity to fight. For example, I think when people talk about Monroe doctrine and they focus on these things, they often think that we're not prepared, and that's not the case. Of course, there's lots of factors. One of the most important ones is just the legacy of building of the integration of Latin American peoples and Caribbean peoples that sometimes has suffered vicissitudes, but it still exists. And also, there's military preparation here. The U.S. has not been able to promote, and I don't think it will be able to provoke, elite rupture. Rather, the elite rupture has happened on the other side, with Alvin Horsley separating from Southcom. So that unity. And then there's also arms here, including, many people believe, Russian hypersonic missiles, which will not, I think when people see these recent acts of war, of course, Venezuela will not use them, will not fall into the provocation, but they're here if necessary.
For sure, yeah. That was a phrase that I heard over and over at the beginning of the conference. I found unexpected to me, just maybe because I've been steeped in Middle Eastern war for the past 2 years, was how much emphasis there was on peace, how much people were like, it was a conference for peace. And one of the slogans, I didn't know this slogan, El hombre de la paz se llama Nicolás, the man of peace is named Nicholas, as in Maduro. I like that chant a lot, and that would kind of spontaneously came up. That was striking to me, but people also repeated, everybody who said we want peace, we're people of peace, we are ready to defend Venezuela, we'll defend every inch of this territory. So that was, that was something that struck me. The presence of Palestine solidarity was really striking to me and really moving to me. Was like, so many people were wearing keffiyehs, so many people, like, their chants, they always said free Palestine. That was really, really, that really moved me a lot. And then, even the details were so solid, like the environmental concepts. There was a young indigenous man from Panama who was really energetic, and I don't know if you guys saw him, but he was speaking his language, and he was like leading chants, but like talking about something that I think a lot of Western environmentalists don't understand, which is like that indigenous people are like, the environmental issue is an indigenous issue, and the solution to environmental problems is giving the land back to indigenous people. And so he had that, so those were all really, really striking to me. The preparation, like you said, and it was sad. It was sad not to be there. Cuba, the presence of Cuba and Cubans was great. There was a delegate. So when I was a lot younger, there was this whole movement to free the Cuban Five. There were these five, Cuban anti-terrorist, operatives who were in jail in America for 15 years. And so it was like free the Cuban Five, and there were events here in Toronto about the Cuban Five, and then the Cuban Five were free, and it was like, oh my God, this is, once in a while these things happen, right? And so this was one of these Cuban Five, and he was talking about imperialism and the U.S. role and things like that, and that was really cool to see him on the stage there.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the provocations, and kind of like self-restraint that Venezuela has had to show here, which was also expressed through the assembly, but actually it has been expressed since the beginning of this new escalation in militarist buildup against Venezuela. Of course, we know about the heist that happened just yesterday of the oil tanker of the skipper. And probably we will talk more about that. But in general, I think that it's important to have a perspective on this issue of provocations and actually self-restraint, which is actually, which from outside it may not be so obvious, but really, since this whole thing began in August, not only have there been more than 20 strikes on boats, on international waters, but absolutely illegal outside of all law. There are extrajudicial killings. But there's flights. Just yesterday also, there was a flight of X-16 airplanes very close to Venezuela's airspace, but actually they are obviously, like kind of like really bordering. If we there's a space there's an area of the airspace that kind of like goes like that. The frontier area of the airspace goes like that, and they kept doing this, going over and over, kind of like into the little area that dips in. In terms of the frontier. So there's these constant provocations, and Venezuela could actually, with these missiles that Chris was talking about, it could down those airplanes. But of course, that would be the new phase in the war. That is what the U.S. wants. They want this war to be escalated with a Venezuelan action on our end, so that then they can say that they have a reason. And the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people have, there's been a tremendous discipline to just hold on, because of course we have to defend our sovereignty, we have to defend the project, but we cannot go into war lightly. The people of Venezuela, the government has to do everything possible to avoid it. And that is something that people should be aware of. It's like the tremendous amount of discipline that it takes, because actually I think that Venezuelans know that ultimately, if there was an attack on Venezuela, Venezuela would win. Imperialism would not win, but the bloodshed, the loss in lives would be so huge that we have to do everything possible to avoid it.
Yeah. Chris?
No, I completely agree. That's a long-standing practice here Chavez always said the revolution was pacific but armed. And I think Chavez showed incredible, if not excessive, restraint in the post-coup d'etat period. So I think there's a lot of maturity here. And I was impressed by how Delcy, in her closing discourse yesterday, talked about the importance of building alliances. She mentioned that she wanted to recreate Bolivar did the Congreso Anfitrionico, the anfitrionic, I guess that means like the hosting conference in Panama. I think it's in 1824 or 26, precisely in the wake of the Monroe Doctrine. And that was an effort to unite Latin America in what became the independent country of Panama, but at that time was still part of the Gran Colombia. And that kind of stands as a landmark and a historical reference for what's needed. Bolivar used the phrase, making the equilibrium of the universe. And I think one of the most interesting things about Bolivar, or one of the most prescient things too, is how he understood that the world system was not, of course, he didn't understand imperialism. And by some accounts, full-blown imperialism didn't exist at that time. But he understood that the world system was not an equal playing field, and therefore nothing like Pan-Americanism could work. So you need to form a unity of Latin American peoples and Caribbean peoples to create what he called the equilibrium of the universe. And this connects very closely to the ideas of multipolarity that exist today. So I think it's that careful efforts to build force and integration in our continent. She mentioned specifically Mexico and Colombia and Brazil as important allies in building this historical bloc that could confront imperialism.
Yeah. One of the speakers, I think he was from the Venezuelan government in some capacity. He quoted like a quote from Monroe about like before the Monroe Doctrine about Miranda. So Miranda's sometimes called the precursor to Bolivar, and he also was a really important figure in the independence of Latin America from Spain. And Monroe said something like, this if Miranda succeeds in building a huge nation in South America, they'll all have the same language and it'll control huge resources and territory. So we have to stop that at all costs. So it's been since the early 20th century on the minds of the U.S. to
since the early 19th century. He talked about Colombia, but actually Franklin also talked about the importance of keeping an eye. I don't have the quote, it doesn't go like that, but the importance of keeping an eye on the then Spanish colonies and of making sure that they were not united. So this goes back a long. There was an intent that goes back for a longer time. And Colombia, what that I mentioned, was actually the project of Miranda for an integrated Latin American nation, which we call Gran Colombia later through Bolivar.
So because of this, I wanted to just read a little bit from the official communique from Venezuela about the seizure of the tanker. So I think like the main message that I thought was really strong here was, this is not the first time that the president. So we denounce the theft and piracy. Publicly announced by the president of the U.S., who confessed the attack of an oil tanker in the Caribbean. It's not the first time that he admits, including in his campaign of 2024, that his objective has always been to get the oil of Venezuela and not pay. And this is clear that this is the aggression against our country responds to a plan to steal our energy. And this is like I kind of thought this was the communicative strategy was like, okay, let's dispense with this drug pretext, and the Americans have essentially dispensed with it by stealing this tanker, and so Venezuela's kind of like just putting that obvious point on the table.
That's right. I mean, since everybody is already aware that the current discourse, the current iteration of the war against the Bolivarian process, the Bolivarian revolution, is narcoterrorism, then why? I want to say something about this act of piracy, as it's correctly called in the communique. It also mentions in the communique that this is not the first one. In 2019 and 2020, there were similar piracy attacks on boats, in that case, that were coming from Iran to Venezuela.
Yes, that's right.
That was a very difficult time here in Venezuela because it was the beginning of the harshest phase of the unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela. So when the sanctions began, they began in 2014, 2015, with the Obama decree declaring Venezuela an extraordinary threat. But actually, the toughest sanctions really begin in 2018 and then 2019. By 2019, all of a sudden, Venezuela did not have access to diluents.
Yeah.
So even though Venezuela has a lot of oil, it doesn't process diluents. So all of a sudden, there was no gasoline in Venezuela. It was a really, really difficult time. Of course, there was no medicine. There was not enough food to go around. And around that time is when the U.S. seized some of these shipments in these acts of piracy. This one, this current situation, this current attack actually was on a boat, and this is very painful, on a boat that was going to Cuba. The current situation in Cuba is tremendously difficult. So this was not only an attack on the Bolivarian Revolution and on the government of President Nicolas Maduro, but it's also an attack against the people of Cuba. I think it is important, just like we have to always center Palestine, we also have to begin to recenter Cuba.
Yeah.
Because the situation in Cuba with the sanctions, because it is an island and because it doesn't have the resources that Venezuela has, the situation of the Cuban people is tremendously difficult at this time. So I think that we have to be recentering Cuba and understanding that this act of piracy is an act of piracy that will hurt the people of Venezuela, but I would dare to say that it will hurt more the people of Cuba. The situation in Cuba, I want to repeat this, the situation in Cuba is tremendously painful. The blackouts go on for hours. There are also medicine shortages and food shortages. So look, I mean, they are killing two birds with one stone. Of course, they are not killing either bird, but they are hurting the two revolutions with one single act. And it should be denounced for the act of piracy that it is against Venezuela, and for the crime that it is against the people of Venezuela and against the people of Cuba.
I want to say something about the way I think the communique is right on the mark, as you were saying. It basically says that things have become very explicit right now.
Yeah.
And I guess that's one of the characteristics of Trump's way of operating, which I would call fascist. I mean, he essentially likes to celebrate violence.
Yes.
In fact, when he was talking about the extrajudicial killings on the boats, he just said, "And then we killed them, and they're dead." And that's so he likes to celebrate.
Yeah.
He likes to celebrate violence. I remember here there used to be, maybe 10 years ago, there used to be these little micro videos on public television that tried to explain what imperialism is. And I think anyone who's tried to explain imperialism to people in classes or in talks often is confronted with challenges, like you have to explain value chains or unequal exchange. And right now, with Trump's explicitness, you don't need to even go so far. It's just, as Cira says, piracy. I remember Amilcar Cabral said that tried to explain imperialism. He said it was piracy on dry land. Well, this is just piracy.
Piracy.
Outright. So, and I actually did the calculation. If it's a 1.1 million barrels of oil, then of crude, then that's about $63 million that were just seized. Not as much as the Citgo seizure, not as much in value, but just an outright appropriation of assets. At the same time, I also want to draw something. This is something for a longer discussion. I do think sometimes we as observers, concerned observers, to say the least, of Trump's irrationalism, his fascist attitude, sometimes we fail to get to the real issues. Sometimes we accept his fascist discourse we see it as madness or mere madness or cruelty, without looking at what's really going on. For example, I do think some of the muscle flexing in his proclaiming the Trump updating of the Trump corollary, the Trump updating of the Monroe doctrine, I think some of that muscle flexing can be taken as can distract us from some of the other issues, because I don't think for a minute Trump has abandoned China as a principal enemy. I think a lot of some of what's going on is changing the battleground for China, which will be here, or might be more here in this context. But I think it's
Well,
far from believable that Trump would have abandoned China as the main
yeah.
enemy and the main rival.
Well, the enemy's the whole world, but also like historically, the Monroe Doctrine was about kicking Britain out of the hemisphere, right? The Monroe Doctrine was, leave us alone. We're doing the imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, and we won't bother you in India or wherever else. So it was not really like the way they think about Latin America is just as a resource, not as a rival. So this doctrine is about telling your rival to leave you alone as you plunder Latin America. And so if the rival was Britain in the 19th century, the rival's China now, right? This is basically like we don't want China to interfere with our attempt to starve or punish or sanction or squeeze these economies by just going and doing deals with them. This is our hemisphere to enslave, basically.
That's right.
If I
Actually,
could
there's
say,
a quote. Go ahead.
no,
Well,
I
there's a
just want to
quote.
say,
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah, you
I'll,
go.
I'll very briefly read a quote from the document. It says, "We want the hemisphere to remain that we want the hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursions or ownership of key assets, and that supports critical supply chains. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations." So they say it outright. I mean, actually, they mean mostly Chinese interference, but and they call them hostile foreign incursion. I mean, like really, saying what you may of China, but there's nothing hostile about how it operates in terms of its participation in global trade and in investment of infrastructure. So it actually is extremely very much actualized Monroe Doctrine. It really is a Trump corollary that brings it to the present. And it is, and I think this is something that Chris was saying, there is I think that when we think about Trump, he is a fascist and he's an enemy of humanity, and he represents those who are the enemies of humanity. But they are also operating to a certain degree on a scientific basis, on a recognition that they are losing ground, and they really are losing ground. This is something that the Democrats don't do. They don't recognize that they are losing ground. The Democrats are also representatives of or spokespeople of U.S. imperialists, the U.S. imperialist classes. They don't recognize this real crisis, but Trump and his people do it.
I wanted to say something about how I mean, just the nature of now we're talking about the national strategy, strategy document. And I wanted to point out that that's in some sense a misnomer. It's not really the U.S. strategy. This is our bureaucratic document that comes out and it has a lot of stuff that's simply supposed to please Trump's bases. Like, does anyone really believe that part of the strategy is Europe's civilizational self-confidence, increasing Europe's this is something I quote from it. He refers to Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. So these things are just kind of like efforts, crowd pleasing for the MAGA bases. That it's not really, and no one really, no bureaucrat really looks at this document who's going to make strategic decisions. So this is, and tellingly, actually, the document was very late in its production. It took them a long time to get it out. I understand there was just kind of different spheres of the bureaucracy. Each wanted to get their language in. And so it would be a mistake to take it as a real strategy. I believe that it downplays the reality of China continuing to be their main target. Another thing I wanted to point out that's like doctrines don't dominate people unless they're accompanied by real forces and real motives, right? So here, I think one real motive here, a very real motive you can see is the the kind of last one of the hopes, the hope we're seeing now, to kind of kick the U.S.'s stagnating economy and get it going, and that's the supposed AI revolution and the electronic vehicle network projects. And of course, those are the very specters that stood up on the, when Trump was inaugurated, those specters of the Silicon Valley are the people who stood up behind him. And so those interests are very much Trump's, if any fascist project is articulated between, on the one hand, the 1,000th% that it actually serves and the kind of the masses that it fools. So that 1,000th% that actually benefits from Trump, that's what they're counting on. They're counting on generating some kind of relatively long-term bubble of speculation related to the AI revolution. But all that needs energy, and it needs it quick. They can't, as they know, they can't rely on green energy. They've missed the boat on solar energy, and so they need fossil fuels. So I think that, as you were saying, Justin, the need to secure Latin America's resources, at the same time secure them away from China, deny them to China. Energy has always been central to these transitions that they're hoping to make, to kind of kick the can down the street in the U.S. economy on the AI, on AI speculation. I call it AI speculation because they think it's a revolution. But I think it's a bubble they just want to run for 10, 15 years. But to do all that, they need to build new energy production based on fossil fuels. And that's where Latin America's resources come into play.
It's really interesting because, like, Petro, I remember that 2 hour, I don't know if you guys listened to that. I know Cira did. We talked about it last time we talked, but that 2 hour thing with Petro and Danielle Coronel on Colombian TV. And Petro had this whole thing about, and I mean, the Madre Tierra session also talked about this at the Asamblea, but Petro talked about how, like, fossil energy is the energy of the past, right? It is gonna have to be renewables, and China already is doing that. Like places like Pakistan, where they had all these intermittency problems with energy, and they've addressed it because solar panels are so cheap because they're next to China. China's just been giving them so many they have more solar panels than they know what to do with, right? So Pakistan is. Their whole grid has changed because of that, and a lot of African countries, South Africa and other countries have gone into this too, and obviously that's a real, the AI thing is a bubble, but the solar revolution is probably closer to a real revolution, and that's another thing that the Americans want to stop, especially Cuba, right? Especially Cuba from getting. I mean, if Cuba could get, the kind of massive amounts of solar panels that Pakistan has now, they would be in a different situation altogether. And it's like you have to have a siege to stop that, and so that's what they have. They have a siege that's stopping that.
Actually, with Cuba, there is a large investment from China for solar. It's just, of course, it is much further from China, but this is actually the hope for the people of Cuba right now. It'll take maybe a year to 2 years to really get it going, but it's going to increase by about 20% the capacity of Cuba's energy making system, and that has been done to a great degree with a very, very beneficial for not only obviously that Cuba needs electricity. They often talk about their alumbrones instead of apagones. Apagones when you have a blackout, and they say alumbrones because sometimes, like the more common, it's kind of like a running joke, a very difficult running joke. That sometimes it seems like there's more time when there's no light than when there's light. In any case, with the whole thing about Cuba, fortunately, China has made large investments on solar, and that's actually tremendously important at the moment.
We had a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. Speaking of China, I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on this article from I got sent it today, but it's from December 5th by Atilio Boron, and he basically says, China needs to do a siege on Taiwan. That's the only way to prevent an attack on Venezuela. And I was like, man, if that's the only way, then we're in big trouble because I don't see that happening. Did you guys see
Yeah,
that?
I actually did see that article, but I interviewed him about 2 weeks ago, and
Okay.
he was saying that too. Tilio was saying the same thing. Yes, I think that hopefully there's other courses,
Yeah.
because I don't think that China is
Restraint.
going to do it.
You talked about restraint, like
Yes.
the monarch of restraint is China, I'd say.
Yes, I mean, and it actually can be criticized in one recent
Yeah.
case for restraint in terms of what happened at the UN when they abstained in relation to
Yeah.
the vote on the so-called whatever, on the
Twenty
continuation of
three. Yeah.
the
Or
continuation
of the
of
genocide.
the genocide vote.
I wanted to jump to the theme of international solidarity that was
Yeah, I think we're ready
promoted
for
in
that.
the Congress or the conference. And I have to say, as a confession, that I've been for the last 5 years ago, I've been moving towards a crude third worldism in which I don't have any confidence in what even the working class of the global north can offer to the revolution. And I have to say that I
I'm
feel
right there. I'm right there with you.
yeah, but I feel that I stand corrected. I'm impressed.
Oh, okay, okay,
I feel
all
that I
right.
may be standing corrected by some of the things I saw in the past couple of days.
Okay.
There were young people from the United States, 12 brave souls who managed to arrive here, and I was really impressed by their struggles and their solidarity with Venezuela. Like, there's all kinds of nasty, crusty leftists in the global north who will want to give lessons to Venezuela. And for these young people, and some of them not so young, they had none of that. They were totally clear who their allies were. And so that's very refreshing. And at the same time, they come with real struggles, really developed consciousness, really forward-looking consciousness. I think that that's one thing that may be changing right now is that the growth, the burgeoning of fascism in the global north is leading to a situation where you can imagine an alliance between anti-imperialist movements in the global south with the anti-fascist struggle in the global north. I think that anti-fascism pushes people, the presence of fascism, the response, pushes them towards a greater condition of solidarity with the global south. And that's not to say they're symmetrical. It's not a symmetrical situation. Nevertheless, there are, I think, interesting possibilities for alliance. You know, the way Lenin in the 1920s promoted the idea of proletariats of the global north combining with anti-colonial struggles. Maybe something like that is emerging, some possibility of a struggle that combines. Obviously, the anti-fascist struggle is not the same, and there continues to exist not the same as what dominated people in the global south lived through. There continues to be an important phenomenon of labor aristocracy in the global north. But I do think this new situation opens up a window, and I feel like I saw it with my own eyes. I thought it was very exciting to hear what people were saying, and the kind of natural sympathy and desire to work together that developed in this conference.
Well, I'm happy to hear that.
That happened. This is very recent news. Of course, we are talking about this. It's not news. It's actually a space that has been built through the assembly. The Instituto Simón Bolívar has been promoting and exercising, or a solidarity platform of the people of Venezuela with the people of the United States, and it was actually just launched today at El Panal Commune. That's the commune. I'm part of El Panal Commune. So there was a really very meaningful space of sharing, and that's where we learn from all these young folks, and yes, some not so young, but mostly very young people from LA and from Chicago, about their struggles and about their victories, in terms of some small victories, some larger, like some divestment victories, or of course the larger, more recent victory in Chicago, where ICE and the National Guard were actually kicked out. So it's really important for us to hear firsthand from people who are struggling in the US about their struggles, and also because they are indeed brave to be coming here. Everybody
Yeah.
who wanted to come here. Some of them couldn't happen, but everybody who came here, especially from North America, was brave to do it, because there might actually, it's very true at the moment, that there might be consequences for them as they go back home. And seeing it and having this space be happening from a commune also makes it all the more meaningful, right? Because I mean, from my perspective, the commune is a place from which, hand in hand, of course, with the government, from which the society will be transformed. The social relations in our society will be transformed from the commune. So having this internationalist effort happen from a commune, that was very, yes, I guess the word is meaningful. I don't know what other word to find, but it was also a teaching experience for us, a learning experience for us, rather.
That's really nice. I won't say. I'm not gonna say anything bad about people who are trying to do things wherever they are, and so, like, just to let, I guess we can close as it approaches midnight for you guys where you are. When I see this this robbery of this oil today or yesterday, I guess it was today. Yesterday. It was yesterday. I just think, like, shouldn't everybody be alarmed? Like, do all the countries of Latin America, like, does Brazil and Colombia and these other countries, do they just think that they can't just possibly think that it's just gonna be Venezuela? Like, if the Americans succeed in doing this, the precedent is just that they can go take whatever they can take and just take oil or whatever robbery they want to do on the high seas. So how's there's solidarity from the North, but there's also, I would hope there would be some regional sense of alarm among the governments, not just the peoples. Like, the Asamblea was about the peoples, but what are we looking at in terms of regional response to this piracy? Anything?
Well, I mean, there has to be more, as you say. Everybody should be alarmed. There should be a select, and I think that there seemed to be some movement in that direction, but this is not official. There has to be a response to it. Alba, of course, will have an immediate response very soon. So yes, everybody should be alarmed, and no matter what the line, the political color of your government is, you people of Latin America and the Caribbean should be extremely alarmed, because like, I think it's not going to. We don't think it's going to stop there. They stopped bombing these extrajudicial bombings of the boats in September, and they keep at it. And this is not going to be the first one in this latest iteration. So everybody should be concerned, and specifically, I would say in this moment, the government of Brazil, Lula, has to begin to be more. There has to begin to define a more sovereign position for the region. It is actually super important that Brazil does it at this moment, and we are not very happy with Lula. There have been frictions. There have been frictions with Colombia, with Petro, but Petro actually, when it comes to these kinds of situations, he tends to have the correct position, even though there have been some frictions there. And we haven't seen the same. We haven't seen the same with Lula.
No.
So
No.
yeah.
Petro talks a lot. So, like, some of the stuff he says is great, and then some of the stuff he says is like when the other day he said, Colombia needs a transitional government, and I mean, not Colombia, Venezuela needs to go to a transitional government. I was like, what where did that come from? Like,
Yeah,
Anyway.
it is.
Yeah,
Well,
well, I think one of the great successes of a conference like this that we just had here is that it kind of clearly sets the high moral ground. I mean, it's not as it's I hesitate from I shy away from grand claims like this, but there is a civilizational alternative being presented here, especially with the communes and with
Yeah.
socialism being a civilizational alternative. I think that's something people felt when they were in the commune today. And in that sense, you can see a civilizational collapse in the global north, centrally in the United States, but not uniquely there.
Yeah.
So, like when Petra says something like a government of transition, I think they need to have a government of transition in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's where the government of transition should be taking place. So
Yeah,
it
like
is pretty. I think it's impressive the way the high moral ground was taken here, and I think that leads us to be able to say something like that. That's where the transition needs to be taking place is in Washington.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Oh man. So I guess the word of the night is restraint, and so that means there's probably going to be more provocation that will be responded to with restraint. It's going to be it's going to be a frustrating. It's going to be a frustrating little while, I'd say.
Well, we've been through it before.
Yeah.
This is like a new chapter of potential, returning to the dark days of the blockade. We've been through that before, and Cuba's been through it 65 years.
Yeah.
So one of Bolivar's legacies, one time, Preux de la Croix, I think he was a French writer who accompanied Bolivar. He recorded the diary of Bucaramanga, and he asked Bolivar what his most important virtue is. And he said, perseverance. That's my most important virtue. So I guess maybe that's the Bolivarian virtue of the moment right now. Persevere, hold on, and for the long haul.
and of course, the preparation, we should not, we haven't mentioned it today, although when we talked before, Justin, we did talk about it, but I think it is important to mention that while there is restraint, there's also absolute a mass effort to prepare to defend Venezuela with the militia. I mean, like more than 8 million people are enrolled in the militia. Millions have enrolled in the most recent times. So while there's restraint, there's also a preparation. And if it happens, which it may, and when we talk about it, we mean
invasion.
Not necessarily an old-style invasion. We think it's unlikely that the Marines are going to land in La Guaira and enter Venezuela, because it would really be a disaster for the
U.S. It would be a short landing.
So that is not likely to happen, but it is likely that they will do targeted actions on land, and those actions could be on, government figures or infrastructure, and they'll probably, or maybe like, who knows, airfields or things like that, and maybe they'll go back to talking about narcoterrorism. Whatever shape it takes, they'll do it with the intention of activating paramilitary cells hopefully activating paramilitary cells and generating an internal situation of civil war. But the militia really has a grassroots articulation, and I think that this is very important, because in my commune and in every commune, there's people who are preparing and who are in part of the militia, and this has, it's a grassroots military operation, but that it's linked to the standard. I don't know how to call it, to the more conventional, rather, professional military operation structures, and as it is connected to the conventional professional military structures, there is a line to convey information from the bottom up. So that is going to be very important if the U.S. Attacks Venezuela. And I think the U.S. may actually attack the land of Venezuela, because it's been attacking Venezuela for a long time. But I actually think at this moment that that Trump may have to do it. Even just recently, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal where they're basically telling him, "What are you waiting for?" So they're kind of like taunting him, Trump. And so actually I think we have to be cautious, we have to be restrained, but also we have to be ready, and we are ready. I think we are ready, and we will succeed, but it will not be easy. We hope that it can be avoided.
Chris,
One thing I'd like to say is that even though things are, the circle seems to be getting tighter, and maybe I can say precisely why. It's that we're in a good moment here in the Bolivarian process. I think things have been going right for the past 5 years. Nicolas Maduro figured out how to overcome the worst of the blockade, kept the unity of Chavismo, turned to the left around 3 years ago, began relying on the people. So basically, we've been on a roll here, to put it that way. And I think that was reflected in Dulce's very strong discourse yesterday afternoon. Like hitting that, defending Fidel. She said Fidel is was the person who stood up saying that history hadn't ended, that we were going to go on struggling. And so I think in some sense we're on a roll, and maybe that's precisely why one of the main reasons why they're being so aggressive against us. But I want to say that this is in some way, we shouldn't forget this is in some way a good moment for the Bolivarian process, in spite of the attacks, in spite of what seems to be a tightening circle. There's force here, and there's moral authority.
I like that. That's good enough to end on for tonight. Thank you both very much.
Thanks so much, Justin.